I don't think I'm the first person to comment that America today is a nation politically divided, the most so in the last 100 years. And if you're anything like me, you're probably tired of hearing people talk about how awful the political climate is. But I waited to release this video far after the election, so not to create a comment section of unimaginable horrors when tempers were running high earlier. Yet this division brings up the question, what if the unimaginable was to occur? What if civil war did break out between the Republicans and Democrats? How would America and the world as a whole change? That is the question of this video. Firstly, I don't know if war will break out, but that's not the point of this video. I won't give any opinion on the subject, and I'll simply say that this video is to see what if that were to happen, not judging its plausibility. Also, it doesn't matter how the war starts, I'm just going to say that it does, and the battle lines are similar to the last few elections. I understand that for the outsiders that make up 59% of my audience, the American political system can get complicated and get simplified to a ridiculous level abroad, so I'm going to briefly summarize the two parties. The party who currently has the president, the Republicans, have the symbol of the elephant. They tend to be a coalition of nationalists, libertarians, and social conservatives. Their opponents in the party of the previous president are the Democrats. The Democratic symbol is the donkey, and they tend to be a coalition of ethnic minorities, social progressives, and advocates for big government. The Republicans dominate rural regions, the Democrats in cities, and the suburbs tend to be fair game. A Finnish comedy show once described it as the elephant cowboys against the hippie donkeys, and I think that's not an unfair description. Card-carrying Democrats are 31% of the population, while card-carrying Republicans are 28%. However, they tend to in actuality be far closer, because independents tend to vote Republican more than Democrat. I know people are going to claim I'm biased, but I took a political compass test, and this is where I am. Yes, I tilt a little bit libertarian right, but I'm still dead center, and so I feel like I can judge this fairly objectively. I have Republican and Democrat friends, and I don't dislike either party. So this is a state map of the latest election and the election before it. These maps tend to be really misleading on how an actual civil war would play out, since they lump all voters in a single state into a single camp. The mistake most modern American Civil War scenarios have is that they take this map seriously. For comparison, as you can see when you look at the county level, it's a completely different picture. This is in actuality a far more accurate picture of how a war would play out. I can already hear people typing angrily about how in the other American Civil War, entire states fought in a single grouping, so why not in this one? The reasons are twofold. The first of which, state pride was a far greater force in those days, with people not actually thinking of the US as a united nation, instead of as a collection of states that worked together. Many people have made the claim that state identity was actually more important in the Civil War than national identity. Secondly, the division in the last Civil War is mainly climactic, with the areas that had a climate warm enough to grow crops that needed slaves rebelling, and the states that were too cold to support said crops remaining loyal. This meant that only a couple states were really split, being Kansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, and Virginia. Today, split states are the norm. Almost every state is a countryside that votes Republican and a city that votes Democrat. The norm is that when the countryside cannot vote the city, the Republicans win, and vice versa for the Democrats. Let me give you an example. Nevada, a swing state in which the Democrat city of Las Vegas in the southern tip won Hillary the latest election, while the entire rest of the state is Republican. Can we expect the Republicans to fight for the Democrats just because one city voted Democrat? This is demonstrative of many American states, be it Pennsylvania, Illinois, Oregon, Tennessee, Florida, etc. When it comes to civil war after land control, the most important variable is the military. Whatever side the military sides with is a side that tends to win the civil war, simply because the military's equipment and training proves decisive in the war. In enlisted men, Republicans have around 36%, while Democrats have around 21%. This may not seem like an enormous divide, but when you keep in mind how this compares to the general population, you see the enormous tilt. Meanwhile, libertarians make up between 5 to 10% of the military, and libertarians tend to be allies with the Republicans, making the division even larger. Well, when you look at officers, or the men who can lead and train troops, you see that it's even more Republican, with only 3% identifying as liberals. This is a county map of the very early stages of the war. If you remove isolated patches smaller than 3 counties, I find it unlikely that single counties surrounded by enemies would fight the clearly impossible battle. As you can see, the Republicans control most of the country, the Democrats surviving in patches, there being 5 substantial ones. In the Northeast, California, the Pacific Northwest, the Southern Rockies, and parts of the South. People tend to think of the South as insanely Republican, but there are actually Democratic parts of the South, mainly majority black areas. This disunity would give the Republicans yet another advantage, with them being able to coordinate as a single unit based around likely St. Louis, with all the center of the country being able to pool strength together. The Democrats, meanwhile, would be isolated into many different islands, being separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles from each other. Just before we start, a brief side note. It's been 70 years since we've had a major war between two industrialized nations, and technology has changed quite a bit since then, with new technologies like cyber warfare, mechanized infantry, and satellites. This means that it's kind of hard to predict the mechanics of a future war, just because the world's changed so much and we have very little things to look back on. It's kind of like someone from the Napoleonic Wars trying to predict the American Civil War or World War One. With technologies like the machine gun, the tank, or rapid-firing rifles. And so just expect the mechanics of this future war to be different from how you would expect it to be. At the beginning of the war, both sides would gear up into total war mode and amass large armies. Like the previous American Civil War, this would take some time, and skirmishes would take place as they would happen. The Republicans having more of the military, and thus more men capable of training an army more quickly, and having more material to start with, simply because they would have more land. This would mean that at the beginning of the war, the Republicans would be able to amass an army faster, and thus go on the offensive earlier, while the Democrats would still be gathering their act together. The Republicans would use their offensive energies to first wipe out the Democratic strongholds in the center of the country. The Democrat parts of the South tend to be poor and easily divisible, so wouldn't be able to offer much resistance against the united Republican forces. You might get a guerrilla campaign in this region during the rest of the war, but nothing large enough to stop or even hinder the Republican goals. This would happen at roughly the same time as the Republican destruction of the New Mexico-Colorado stronghold. New Mexico would have the same issue as the Democratic South, being surrounded, poor, and lightly settled. The Democrats in Colorado, being surrounded and unable to achieve aid from the other strongholds, would be pressed back into Denver, losing the countryside. Large Democratic cities surrounded by Republicans like Denver, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Detroit create an issue. In most civil wars, these cities would keep fighting in long and protracted sieges, knowing that if they gave up, they'd be slaughtered and pillaged by the enemies. So why not keep starving and fighting if it at least gave you a chance of survival? However, America has not yet reached this level of political polarization and nastiness in which Republicans would rape, pillage, and slaughter the population of Chicago for simply being Democrat. No matter what Southern revisionists tell you, the first American Civil War wasn't that bad for civilians. So this wouldn't have to happen either for there to be a civil war. So in this timeline, let's assume things don't get that nasty, and thus Democratic cities can surrender to Republican besiegers with the knowledge they won't get slaughtered, thus making it a better choice than a long protracted siege with starvation and death. This would give Democratic cities like Chicago, Denver, Minneapolis, and Detroit into Republican hands. While the Republicans would be destroying the Democrats in the interior of the country, the Democrats would be shoring up their defenses in their coastal regions. In the east, the Democrats would conquer the Delmarva Peninsula, thus connecting Washington Democrats with Philadelphia, as well as conquering the lightly settled Republican northern New England. The North Carolina Democrats would likely fortify their mountains, waiting for the inevitable Republican attack. In the west, the Democrats would likely connect Seattle with Portland to unite the Pacific Northwest. The California Democrats would likely push into the Imperial Valley as well. The distance would likely be too great for the Democrat Army to connect the Pacific Northwest region with California, since the Democrat Army would still be training and developing their projection abilities. There'd be several flashpoints or theaters at this part of the war. In the East, Virginia would be one, which, if the Democrats would win, would connect North Carolina with Washington and Delmarva, thus uniting the Democratic East. Another would be upstate New York, which the Democrats would likely try to conquer, so to re-seize the traditional Democratic cities of Syracuse and Buffalo, which could create a platform to reinvade the upper Midwest. And also in the West, there would be the Imperial Valley, which creates an enormous amount of food and is a flat valley right next to the probable Democratic Californian capital of San Francisco. Also, Oregon and Northern California, which, if the Democrats would win, would connect the Pacific Northwest with California, thus uniting the Democrat West Coast. It's impossible for me to predict individual tactics and battles, but in general I think the Republicans would over time gain the upper hand in every theater, and I'll explain why next. Firstly, the creation of total war between the two factions would force industry to come back to America in a big way to make all the weapons. The two regions that would reindustrialize the fastest would be the Rust Belt, which used to be the industrial heart of America, and so would have the institutions and facilities for the return of industry. The second would be the American South, which is the least regulation and the cheapest wages. Both of these areas would mainly be controlled by the Republicans, giving the Republicans a market advantage industrially. Training, the Republicans being able to mobilize faster and go on the offensive faster, thus forcing the Democrats to churn out armies to protect their holdings. These armies would be horribly rushed, not having proper training or materiel. Also, more pre-war officers would give the Republicans more experience, likely meaning they'd make better tactical decisions. Thirdly, population resources. The Republicans controlling the entire center of the country would simply have more men to throw at the Democrats. Also, almost all of the U.S.'s food, resources, and oil-producing regions would be in Republican hands. The Democratic strongholds would be dependent upon trade with foreign nations for survival and resources. With the Navy likely turning for the most part Republican, this would mean that the Democrats likely have to put large parts of their resources into building a Navy to simply keep connections with the rest of the world going for supplies, which connects to the next part. The US being the most powerful nation on Earth means that if it splits into civil war, it's everyone's problem. Countries would intervene in the side that would be in their interest. The Republicans tend to advocate an aggressive foreign policy, so countries that would benefit from this would give the Republicans aid. These countries would also want the war to end as fast as possible, so a strong US could return to being a strong player, thus would support the dominant side, the Republicans. These would be countries like Japan, Korea, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Eastern Europe. The Democrats have a more popular opinion around the world, especially in Western Europe. Western Europe would likely send aid of some sort to the Eastern Democrats. However, Western Europe has very little military power, with their militaries being directly dependent upon the United States, so this wouldn't amount to much. The EU might collapse in the strain of Eastern Europe supporting the Republicans, while the West supporting the Democrats. The Chinese and Russians, being America's main rivals, would want the Civil War to go on for as long as possible, so they could have a free hand across the world, while the US would be weak internationally. Thus, they would prop up the losing side, the Democrats, with aid to simply extend the war. They would use the US's lapse from power to conquer the Baltics and Taiwan, respectively. People often say in forums on this subject that Mexico and Canada would side with the Democrats since they share vaguely similar agendas. This is ridiculous. Firstly, because Canada only exists because the US is fine with it. Canada is 10% of the US's population and is dependent upon its military and economy. So Canada needs to get along with whoever is in power in the US, thus they would not want to disturb the Civil War for fear of conquest. They would know that if they sided with the Democrats, the vast majority of their country would be conquered in a matter of weeks, if not days, by the Republicans. No offense, but I'm not sure why some people take Mexico seriously as a military power compared to the US. For a power comparison, Mexico's total GDP is roughly the same as just the US state of Florida. The Mexican military can't even defeat gangs in its own nation, let alone invade the most powerful nation on Earth. The US's military spending is 68 times that of Mexico, and the US Army's is the number one in the world, while the Mexican is only the 28th. I'm pretty sure it's pretty clear who's going to win the war at this stage of the video. The Republicans would now go on focusing their energies in each of the remaining Democrat coasts, destroying them in isolation one by one, likely starting with the smallest one, being the Pacific Northwest. Another Republican advantage is that the Democrats are strung out in long control lines that can be cut easily. For example, if the Republicans conquer northern New Jersey or Havre de Grace in northern Maryland, they would split the Democrat eastern forces in three, thus continually weakening the pooling of forces. We would likely see this principle as the Republicans would split the Democrats into smaller and smaller regions. The war would likely end nastily with the surviving Democrat coastal cities fighting on in urban warfare, continually shoving their enormous populations into the breach with little training and materiel to simply keep going, propped up by the Russians and Chinese. The Republicans would win this war of attrition, but with terrible cost. I'd be surprised if New York, Boston, or San Francisco would come out of this war half the cities they are now. The war's over. The Republicans won in summary because they were able to control most of the country and mobilize a better army faster. Did this result surprise you? How do you think this future America and the world would develop? I'll let you battle out those questions in the comments. What a Faltist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next video. It'll be something exciting and new.